As soon as Jason had stepped past the first stone though, the wailing sound had started, and something came out of the walls. The boy named Jason continued her story. It was all hunched over and it looked like there was a secret trapdoor built into the wall. And then a smell like sulfur and roadkill came out, like a wave of stench. And it took these huge claws and swiped my chest. He lifted his shirt and I gasped. The blood hadn't started to clot, but still kept running down in streams. He must have lost quite a bit by this point, but the adrenaline seemed to keep him going. Black and purple lines went out from the cuts in all directions, reminding me of a wound that had gone septic. As I watched, I could see it worsen moment by moment. Pieces of his skin began to fall off, bones morphing and ripping through his clothes. God, it hurts. Please, something is wrong, Jason said, reaching out towards me. Droplets began to fall from his right eye and then his left one, and he started screaming as his body began to transform into something else. The third girl in the group, a tall brunette teenager, began to point behind Jason and scream. I saw a glimpse of a shorter, red-headed teenage girl, identical to the one in the group, except this one was missing multiple fingers, and her clothes were all torn as well. Blood poured out of her hand where the stumps of the fingers reflexively tightened and loosened at nothing. She looked like she had been stung over and over, her face swollen. The doppelganger looked at the hole in shock as Jason fell to the floor. His scream stopped, but the pieces of bone had started to grow out of his back. He writhed and seized, his eyes rolling into the back of his head and coming back to focus on me a couple more times. "Who are you?" the injured redhead said to the uninjured one, who showed an ear-to-ear grin and began to float above the ground. Her eyes had turned red like flaming embers, and her skin began to rapidly darken into a black sheen. Her body grew, the legs and arms lengthening as all the clothes began to be reabsorbed inside the body of the monster. The injured girl screamed as a floating set reached out his arm towards her, softly rubbing the side of her swollen cheek, before quickly grabbing her by the jaw and snapping her. The sound of the bone fracturing, the look of horror and torment in that girl's eyes were haunting. The brunette girl had used the distraction to run over next to Adam and me. Seth turned his gaze back towards us, ignoring Jason, who was still having a seat on the ground, spitting out foam. "You both intrigued me," he said to Adam in a narrow tone. It seemed to come from the walls around us as well as his reptilian mouth. "But especially you," he said, pointing to me. "And I will make a deal with you, Jeremy. You give me your soul and I will tell you the way to the exit at the center of the labyrinth." I shook my head at this. "How about you go screw yourself?" I said, spiteful. Seth only laughed. Behind him, Jason had stopped seizing and now looked to be either unconscious or gone. "Well, in that case," said Seth, "out of a spirit of fairness, I will give you 3 survivors a 5-minute head start before." He pointed to the cages around us at the sides of the courtyard, smiling. The brunette girl gasped, her mouth a small O of fear. "You wouldn't," she said, starting to cry. Seth laughed at this and put his hands up towards the sky. Adam grabbed one of her hands and they followed my lead as I sprinted towards the tunnel that Mary had taken earlier. I hoped that maybe we could find her again and force her to show us the way towards the center of this maze of horrors, where Seth had claimed freedom lay. As we ran into the dark, cramped tunnels, glowing symbols that hadn't been there before began to illuminate the path in front of us. We came out to the massive chamber where we found Mary, looking over the body of her father. Her clothes were in tatters and her back scarred with countless tiny symbols that had been engraved into her skin. They reminded me of Tibetan scripts that I had seen, or the constructed elvish language in Lord of the Rings. The body of the father was swollen to twice its normal size. Small dribbles of a clotted red coming out of his face, ears, nose, and mouth. I saw hundreds of human-faced insects around his body, many of them crushed with their wings ripped off. It looked as if he had gone down fighting. I wondered where the mutated bugs had gone, but time was running short and I knew that would be a mystery better left for another time. Adam grabbed Mary by the shoulder and rapidly explained the situation. Her eyes dried up, and even though she seemed to look past us at invisible shadow people or whatever other hallucination her insane mind made up, she understood enough of it. And then Seth's voice echoed all around us, coming from nowhere and everywhere. "Time is up, friends," he said, a tone of glee and amusement in his voice. "Open the cages. Release the wanderers." From very far off, I heard metal doors slamming open, and I knew that we had to act. "Mary, show us the way to the safest room you know," I said, needing time to think, and except at that moment, time had run out. We had encountered on the demonic form of Jason, tearing out of the darkness at a superhuman speed, and jumping on the brunette girl. He began to slash and rip at her with huge black talons. His body was hunched, spines sticking out of his spine. His lips were missing, showing huge, bloody teeth instead, and his eyes and skin had turned a pure, sickly white. The deep claw marks on his chest totally healed now. Adam tried stabbing at the monster with his small dagger, but then I remembered that we had weapons only a few feet away, where we had first been abducted. I ran towards the door, grabbing my scimitar. As the monster was focused on ripping the brunette girl to pieces, I came up from behind it and swung as hard as I could. Time seemed to slow down as we sort of connected with its mouth, and the inertia took it deeper and deeper. The monster uttering a final shriek that was cut off at the same time as its throat was severed. The head fell to the floor, the white eyes still looking open with hatred, the lipless mouth still opening and closing, like a fish suffocating on land. The limp body of the monster fell backwards, showing the damage to the girl beneath. She was not yet dead. I knew that it was only a matter of moments now. Her throat had been slashed and pieces of skin on her chest were missing, and I could see spurts of bright red exiting out of a dozen deep gashes every time that her heart beat. She tried to speak, but she only choked on her own words. She died with her eyes open, standing in fear and horror. "We have to go," Adam said, pulling at my arm. I saw that he had gone and grabbed his maze from in front of the locked door 20 feet away, and I realized that he was right. I could hear footsteps approaching down the same tunnel that we had taken. Mary was clearly agitated even more than usual, and was gibbering and saying something unrecognizable. Adam prodded her in the back and whispered something to her, and she nodded and began running. We both followed her closely behind. She took us to a completely different tunnel. This one went further down in a spiraling ramp. We ran for at least 10 minutes and the ramp never leveled off. Torches lined the walls on both sides, giving us light. I wondered just how many stories beneath the ground we were now. It had to have been hundreds. Finally, after what felt like over a mile of descending, we came to a cave system that seemed to glow within its own inner blue light. Stalagmites and stalactites made sharp spikes on both sides of us. Mary pointed to a small door to the right that had been hewn from the rock itself. It had a symbol on it that I had never seen before, resembling a spiral with an arrow pointing up. "That means food," Mary said in a hushed voice. "There are a few of these rooms, though many of them have traps in them." She pushed through and showed us a room filled with cans and bottles. Most of them were empty and gone inside, but I saw dozens more were still unopened along the metal shelving of the back wall. Adam and I quickly shut the door and looked at the food supplies. I realized that I was starving. All of the running and adrenaline exhausted me, and just the thought of food made my mouth begin to water. We quickly opened up some cans of tuna fish and found some bottles of soda in the corner. While all three of us ate and drank as quickly as we could, we tried to formulate a plan. "Do you know where the center of the labyrinth is, Mary?" Adam asked her. She had seemed to take more of a liking to him than to me. It wasn't uncommon, as Adam was a very talkative, selfless, and gregarious person, while I was more of an introvert and a loner. To my surprise, Mary nodded yes to the question. A slim ray of hope entered my mind for the first time in what felt like forever. Adam's eyes sparkled too, as he was excited by the prospect of getting closer to the stage. "We are heading there now," she said while scooping out little bites of plain tuna fish with her disgusting fingers and forcing them into her mouth. "There are less traps at the center, but no food or drink. That's why Daddy and I always stayed closer to the edge, where we could get long pork." He smiled at this. "You mean people," I said, and Adam shot me a glance telling me to shut up. But Mary only smiled wider. "Oh yes, otherwise I would have starved months ago. We have to stretch our food supplies here, but I grew to like the taste of long pork, especially when it was dried and cooked. It reminded me of jerky," she said, licking her lips. "Mary, how long have you been down here?" Adam asked. Mary only shook her head. "That must have been years," she said, frowning. Looking at her sickly, emaciated frame, the rags that she wore that had once been clothing, the way that her shoes were falling apart, I thought she was probably right. And then we began to hear footsteps outside of the door. We all stopped speaking instantly. Adam and I grabbed our weapons and started standing, ready to fight. I motioned to Mary and Adam nodded, giving her the dagger back that he had stolen from her father. I wondered whether it was a smart move, seeing as she was clearly insane and might just stab us in the back to try to eat us. But I had a feeling that we didn't have much of a choice. An old quote ran through my mind. "Misery acquaints a man with strange dead fellows." And I almost felt an urge to chuckle, thinking just how true that really was. Something slammed against the door, sending it flying open. Adam and I waited a moment, Mary behind us. We were out of view of the door, but standing next to the threshold so that, if somebody walked through, we could attack from the side as soon as they stepped a foot into the room. It was what ended up happening. As the surgeon in the mask had entered, a scalpel raised. I tried to bring my weapon down on his head, but he was amazingly fast, ducking at the final moment. The sword whistled harmlessly overhead. He stuck his scalpel into my leg, making me yell out in pain. But Adam took the moment of distraction to bring his mace smashing down on the surgeon. The surgeon's head erupted and bits and pieces of it flew into my mouth as well. I started wiping furiously at the coppery taste, and my lips and I started spitting. The burning pain from my leg rose up, and looking down, I saw rivulets of red soaking into my blue jeans. I hoped that it hadn't hit an artery. "We need to go now." Mary hissed at us and we both nodded. I was significantly slowed down now, hobbling along beside them, but the pain wasn't as bad as I expected. I figured it had been an extremely lucky shot to avoid crippling me and causing me to bleed out down here. Adam ripped off a piece of his t-shirt and made an impromptu bandage, tightening it with knots. We heard more footsteps behind us, and all three of us found huge stalagmites to hide behind, peeking out in the subtle glow of the cave. We saw a few of the faceless humanoids pass us by, one wearing an expensive black suit, and the other two wearing hiking clothing and windbreakers. Their faceless heads seemed to ripple, expanding and contracting. As I wondered if it was a result of them breathing through their skin, I wondered at just what they were in fact. Mary nodded at us and kept going forward, and we did. I could hear shrieks ahead of us. Looking around a bend in the cave, I saw two middle-aged men trying to fight off the faceless monsters. One of them had a pistol. He raised it to the chest of one of them, blowing its heart out. The monster fell back, but another one grabbed him from behind, and the other living monster quickly knocked out the second man. And then the two monsters worked in tandem, one reaching out to the unconscious man's chest, his fingers gently touching the fabric of his shirt. And then with unimaginable strength, he began to pull the man's skin and bones apart. The man shrieked, but the other monster had his arms pinned behind his back too tightly for him to fight back. Soon, they had his heart out of his chest and the man's head had slumped to the side. One of the monsters put it up to his front head. The head appeared to split open in the middle, thousands of tiny black ample teeth showing for a moment as he ate the man's heart. And they let the man's body fall to the side, and the other monster repeated the process with the unconscious man, eating his heart as well. And then they continued forward, with the only remaining sign of their passing being three bodies with massive holes in the chest. Mary, Adam, and I began to move forward again. Countless footsteps were now approaching from behind, and we all began to run as fast as we could. Soon the cave system ended and we came out in an ancient oak forest. The two monsters were waiting for us there, and Adam and I walked forward attacking. And I quickly dispatched the mine, but the one attacking Adam was too quick. The monster had gotten behind Adam and was about to grab him by the neck when Mary jumped in, stabbing her dagger into the spot where the abomination's face should have been. It gave an ear-splitting shriek as its head opened up and it fell back. But the distraction had allowed dozens more monsters from these cages to reach the end of the cave. We all ran for our lives. This way, Mary said, panting. She took us down a small deer trail and we found an ancient stone setup with a heavy door attached. We all got in and found that it had a latch to lock it from the inside. Adam stuck his mace through the latch just as a monster had approached from the outside, beginning to smash at it. I heard dozens of more footsteps from all around us, and I knew that we were surrounded. Well, this is it, I said, sitting down and sighing. There's no getting out of this one, so we can't fight off all of them out there. Mary sat down too, humming to herself, but I noticed that tears were now flowing down her face. Adam only grinned at me, taking his backpack off. Did you forget? Adam asked. I grabbed that book when we first got in here. I told you guys my instincts were screaming at me to take it. He pulled the large, ancient tome out with the title, The Angel of Death, written on the front. Drops of blood constantly dropped off the front of it. The voice of Seth began to vibrate and reverberate around us. Will you give your souls yet, friends? He asked. There's no need for all of you to die like sheep led to the slaughter. For I am the good shepherd, and I hate to see my sheep ripped apart by the wolves. He laughed at us. Adam ignored the voice coming from nowhere and everywhere and opened the door. The pages were blank at first, but then text, written in blood, began to appear. The book was upside down from my point of view, but Adam quickly read it, frowning. Mary, let me see the knife, Adam said, putting out his hand. Mary handed it over. According to the book, all I need to do is say a prayer and carve this name in my arm, and this thing will come to us and save us all. The door to the stone cellar began to shake more violently, as more bodies seemed to show up by the minute. You better hurry up then, I said to him. We don't have much time until those things break through. Fools, the voice of Set screamed. You should not open that book. Do you wish to bring the Watcher to your world? The Watcher will kill the sun, destroy the moon, blot out every star. The Watcher does not care at all for your lives. He continued to ramble until we all ignored it, and Adam began the ritual. The poem appeared in red on the pages and he began to read it, holding a knife over his left arm. An old man dies, a newborn breathes, the bugs feast, the infection proceeds. Winter enters and never leaves. The lone dissenter lives and deceives. The angel of death arises again, the eternal cycle of a bloody reign. As he read the last stanza, he also cut the name Israel into his left arm, wincing for a moment as the sharp knife did its work. And then he held his arm above his head, the blood trickling down, forming and reforming into large and larger rivulets, and then turned sharply and aimed directly at his heart. As soon as the first drop had reached the center of his chest, appearing to defy gravity as it rolled down and back up his chest, an amazing and horrible thing started to happen. Adam's eyes began to emanate a soft, glowing white light, and he began to float above the ground. Behind him, I saw dozens of visions of his floating body splitting off, as if I was looking into a mirror image reflected into another mirror image. The dozens kept going until it looked like hundreds, and then millions, and then eternity, disappearing into a point at the horizon. Each of the bodies began to fade in and out, and then eyes started to come into view, swarming and morphing all over these countless bodies. Soon I couldn't see anything that once had been Adam. His entire body was covered in soft, glowing white eyes that stared out in all directions at once. And then the billions of eyes on the eternal bodies all turned to me at once, and I felt an impending sense of terror and doom of an intensity that I had never imagined possible. Who calls on me? A soft voice said from everywhere and nowhere at once. It slightly shook the walls and floor. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. The eternal copies of Adam's body all collapsed into one in a single moment, and I was back to just staring at the spot where Adam's body had been. The endless hallway of mirror images disappearing instantly. Mary stood up, backing away to the very edge of the cellar. I knew that I had to answer, even though all those staring eyes seemed to bring me to the brink of madness. "We need your help, Azrael," I said. The angel laughed as the door began to splinter. I could see claws and hands reaching through, feeling around for what held it shut. One of them began to snake close to the mace and shake it loose. "And why would I help you?" he asked, the voice seeming to shake the ground with every syllable. "Because," I said, pointing, "Settles release those things to kill your host. And without a host, I have a feeling that you'll be going back to whatever otherworldly prison you came from." The eyes of the angel all turned towards the door as the mace fell out and the door swung open. Dozens of monsters began to pour in. The floating angel laughed at this, raising his arms. Huge thorns and spikes began to shoot out of the leaves and dirt, wrapping around each of the monsters and dragging them into the ground. Within seconds, their screams had all ceased. No one stood there. From behind me, I heard another deeper voice. A set of fiery eyes were embedded into the stone wall that he stepped out. His black poisonous body appeared at once. He and the angel of death stared at each other for a long moment. Mary grabbed my arm and we began to back out of the stone cellar. As we got to the threshold, Seth raised one arm, and the ceiling began to collapse on Azrael. Massive blocks of stone fell on his head, and within seconds he was buried. The cacophony of the collapsing structure made my ears ring, and Mary and I began to sprint, climbing ahead. As I looked back, I saw the stones go flying up in the air, as we were floating up from the place where the stone cellar had stood. Seth was also flying, glancing down at his enemy with hatred. Azrael raised an ethereal hand, and a huge oak tree was ripped out of the ground and went flying in Seth's direction. He easily blocked it. flying higher into the forest and letting it pass harmlessly underneath them. Up ahead, I saw a hatchway in the middle of the forest. It didn't look like it belonged, but I knew that we had to find somewhere to hide. As said in Azrael fought, I ran up to an opening at it, and what I saw astonished me. I was looking down into the hatchway, but on the other side, I was looking up through the spot next to where Adam and I had parked my car. I looked back and saw Azrael and Seth throwing fire and lava at each other, setting the forest alight around them. I nodded at Mary and he jumped through without hesitation, and then I followed. It was a disorienting experience, going down through the hatchway only to find myself crawling up out of a secret dirt door a few feet in front of my car. As soon as I was out, the door slammed shut behind me, and it turned back into flat dirt. I looked around and saw that there was no longer a gas station there, just endless trees. I brought Mary to the hospital and then I went home, wrapping up my own wounds with a first aid kit. I didn't know what to do about Adam. After washing and sleeping, I decided to go to the police station the next day and report Adam missing. I told them that I had brought him home from work, but that I hadn't been able to get in contact with him since then. They ignored my report, saying that if he still hadn't shown up in a couple more days, then I should come back. I have a feeling that I will likely never see him again. His sacrifice allowed Mary and me to escape that horrid place, however. I hope that he's still alive somewhere, and that maybe he will find a way out just like we did. But whenever I sleep now, I hear Adam screaming. In my dreams, he always has pure white irises and pupils, and he always looks around with terror, asking where he is. Behind him, I see an eternal sky covered in ethereal, glowing eyes.
I've been flying as a bush pilot in Alaska for the last 5 years or so. It's a pretty good job for the right sort of person. It goes without saying that you need to be a pretty handy pilot, specifically of small and light aircraft. But beyond that, it also requires a special sort of personality. Folks who thrive on social interaction and the safe comfort of civilization need not apply. Being self-sufficient and mechanically inclined are pretty much prerequisites for those who want to stay on this side of the grave. And I'd say it's fairly important that you have a level head and don't have a tendency to panic in stressful situations. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about thrill seekers or those who don't have a healthy respect for death. Those folks don't tend to last too long in this business. They either end up as another in the long list of missing planes that gains new entries each year, or else they quickly learn that their employers aren't willing to risk their expensive equipment and cargo with someone that isn't going to take every possible precaution to ensure the safe return of said aircraft. I'm just saying that you have to be able to set your fears aside when you're in the thick of it. If something goes wrong, you need a clear head. You can always puke or pass out once you're safely on the ground again. I've had my share of cold sweats, standing on a frozen runway after a close brush with the afterlife. Me? Well, I'm a transplant from South Florida, where I spent most of my time doing puddle jump charters in a small twin-engine Beechcraft. Interesting, sure, but dealing with people has never been my strong suit. I'm not exactly the sociable sort, even less so when I'm trying to fly. When you've got 4 passengers sitting a couple feet behind you and expecting you to play tour guide on their 2-hour flight across the Everglades, it gets old pretty quick. Or at least it did for me. I guess it works for some people. Anyway, a flying buddy of mine that I hadn't talked to in years called me up out of the blue one day with a lead on an open seat at the Bush Charter Company he'd been working with out of Fairbanks. One of their pilots had decided that the harsh Alaskan winters and isolation were more than his nerves could take. So he gave his notice, packed his bags, and headed back south. Truth be told, I'd never really considered looking for a gig in Alaska. I always had the impression that most of the bush pilots working there had been flying STOL. That's short takeoff and landing. In the back country, since they were old enough to walk, Nick assured me that there were plenty of respected pilots up there who'd originated from the lower 48. When he floated the salary numbers in my direction, I didn't take too long thinking about it before I'd made my decision. And 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in the offices of my new employer. That was a while back. And although it took a bit to become accustomed to the type of bush flying that this place demands, I settled in pretty quick, and I was soon assigned my permanent ride, Maggie, after a yellow lab I had as a kid. Man, what a beauty she is. Solar yellow with black piping and looking just as pristine as when she rolled off the assembly line in 1967. The Beaver is probably the best bush plane to ever grace the skies, and I'm fairly certain that Maggie saved my ass from a stupid mistake on more than one occasion. Anyway, I'm getting off track. So, at the time this story took place, I'd been flying for Viking Bush Charters for probably a year or so. I just returned from dropping supplies to a ranger station up near Denali when I got a call over the radio from my dispatcher. I was in the hangar at the time, getting a hot cup of coffee while the mechanic was refitting Maggie with her Tundra tires, swapping out the floats I'd needed for the supply drop-off earlier. The big, almost cartoonish tires were perfect for most of the areas I tended to fly into, and made for a soft, if energetic landing. I was looking forward to getting back to my trailer and relaxing, maybe watching a movie before dozing off. But the crackle from my two-way told me that my exciting plans for the night might not play out. Go for Hooper, I answered, taking a sip of the steaming coffee. The voice of Buck Jacobs replied through the light static.
Hey, Hoop, what's your status?
Mike's working on Maggie's gear. I was getting ready to head home for the evening. What's up? There was a moment's pause before Buck replied.
Sorry, Hoop, but I need you to do a turnaround. We just got a call from a ranger station up near Birch Creek. They got someone up there that had a run-in with a brown bear and is pretty banged up.
I cursed under my breath, but there wasn't any real venom in it. I learned a while ago that up here, everybody helps when it's needed. You never know when it's going to be you on the other side of that call. Can't they fly him out themselves? I asked, but I was already walking around my plane to where Mike Nichols was working.
Negative, Hoop. It's an emergency and we're the nearest phone call. I'd send Jackie, but she's not back from her run-up to Minto yet.
He replied, Okay, Buck, no worries. I'll help Mike get Maggie refit and prepped. I should be wheels up in an hour or so, I said.
Thanks, Hoop. I'll have the details in your hands in 15. Dispatch out.
And there went my relaxing evening. True to my prediction, I was taxiing down the company's private runway an hour later, the vibration from the big radial engine creating a gentle thrumming that filled the interior. It was just before 3 p.m. when I was airborne, and being that it was late February, I knew I had just over 2 hours before sunset. So long as everything went smoothly, that should have been enough time to reach the ranger station, load up the passenger, and get back to Fairbanks before dark. The weather was pretty good when I left, and although the reports were calling for snow that evening, the sky was clear as I rose above the trees and turned northeast towards the ranger station. Everything was going smoothly for the first 30 minutes, before those distant storm clouds I'd been watching on the horizon suddenly seemed to take a keen interest in me and headed my way much faster than I'd have liked. To make matters worse, I'd started to notice a subtle bumping sensation intermittently coming from the engine. I wasn't sure if I was starting to lose one of the 9 cylinders, or if it was something else, but it was definitely something I was keeping my eye on. If I'd been on a regular supply run, I'd have turned around and headed back to Fairbanks right then, but I was acutely aware that anyone who'd had a tangle with a grizzly was probably in a bad way. My flight out to the Birch Creek Ranger Station may very well mean the difference between life and death for this unfortunate soul. After another 15 minutes, I knew that I wasn't going to make it to the ranger station. The storm clouds that had been approaching had now overtaken me and covered the afternoon sky in a thick blanket of gray-black ugliness. I could see the periodic flashes of lightning within them, and the air had grown turbulent. To make matters worse, that engine miss I'd been feeling had become more frequent and severe, and I was sure that I now had multiple cylinders that were beginning to fail. I grabbed the VHF and radioed back to dispatch. Viking ground. Viking 320 Foxtrot. Buck's voice crackled through a moment later.
Viking 320 Foxtrot. Viking ground. Ready you, Hoop.
Buck, I've run into some real nasty weather here. I've started picking up some engine issues. I'm afraid I'm going to have to abort and head for home. Please advise Birch Creek Ranger Station of my situation. Buck didn't argue. He knew I wouldn't abort a pickup like this for a few snow flurries.
Roger that, Hoop. Looking at the weather radar now. Advise you make your heading 185 degrees and drop to 900 to avoid the worst of it.
Roger that. Viking 320 Foxtrot out, I said, banking the plane to the right and starting my return to the airfield. The storm front, which had overtaken me from my left, had also descended with its approach, bringing the clouds low and thick. I pushed forward on the yoke, starting my descent to Buck's recommendation, and hoping that there weren't any errant mountains in my way. 5 minutes later, I was fighting with the wind for control of Maggie, and I was now nearly in a whiteout condition, relying almost exclusively on my instruments for navigation. The turbulence was getting severe, tossing the workhouse bush plane around like a kite in a gale. More than once, the groaning of the wing struts made me wonder if the storm was pushing Maggie past her comfort zone and testing the limits of her airframe. I descended a bit more, dropping to 500 feet, aware that in these low visibility conditions, I was pushing my luck with the terrain. The air was a little cleaner down here though, and the visibility a little better, but I was still being thrown around. And I knew I'd have to climb again pretty soon in order to clear the ridgeline I knew was not too far ahead of me. An unnerving metallic popping noise from above my head drew my attention momentarily. And in that moment, I made the decision that I had to find a place to set her down and wait out the storm as best I could. The trees below me were becoming visible now at this altitude, their peaks piercing the low cloud cover and heavy snowfall like ghostly claws, reaching up from the depths of some abysmal grave to drag me down. The biggest issue I faced now was finding a suitable place to land safely. I knew that the winds had pushed me off course, and I wasn't as familiar with this area as most others I spent time flying over. I wasn't aware of any landing strips nearby and was just praying to find a large enough clearing to accommodate her. Another engine miss. Worse this time. This time, the strained drone of the radio cut out completely for a half second before resuming, and for the first time since I'd come to Alaska, I realized that there was a very real possibility that I might not make it home. If the engine died completely in what now was a strong tailwind, my airspeed would quickly drop until one of my wings stalled. When that happened, it would quickly wing over and I tumbled to the ground in an unrecoverable death spiral. It might be months or years before my wreckage was discovered out here in the wilderness. I considered trying to turn into the wind to keep as much airspeed as possible in that event, but it was gusting bad enough that I was afraid to attempt it, especially with a limping engine. I was getting ready to radio dispatch and let Buck know of my worsening situation when the thick clouds parted ahead of me briefly. In that instant, I thought I'd won the most important lottery of my life. Directly ahead of me, a quarter of a mile out, was the unmistakable rectangular shape of a small airstrip. It was covered in snow that I hoped wasn't too deep, but it was my salvation, a lifeline that I wouldn't dare refuse. I quickly adjusted my approach and set my flaps as I made for it. Another strong gust fought me, trying to throw me out of alignment with a narrow clearing, but I fought back with throttle and rudder as best I could as I watched the altimeter steadily wind down like an analog clock going backwards in time. I reached out for the radio handset to advise Buck of my situation and estimated location, but the next gust almost tore the yoke out of my left hand, and I snapped instantly back to a white-knuckled, two-handed grip. My altitude dropped to 200 feet. I was going too fast. I knew that. At this speed, I'd either overshoot the strip altogether and slam into the dense tree line, or I'd hit the ground so hard that I'd shear off my gear and probably break my back in the process. I couldn't slow her down any further, though, or I'd risk dropping below stall speed in the strong tailwind, and that would mean a quick trip to a frozen ground. 100 feet. Maggie's wings dipped below the tree line now as I entered the long and narrow swath of the landing strip, the tall cedars and spruces towering around me for boating length. The tailwind dropped, obstructed by the great barrier of trees behind me, and I took a breath to thank whatever powers that be for this unexpected bit of good fortune. 50 feet. With the flaps set to full, I bled off airspeed quickly, and my reflexes took over, transitioning from my near ballistic flight to a more controlled approach. 10 feet. I pulled back on the yoke and momentarily throttled up as my gear kissed the top of the snow, flaring the bush plane and setting down a bit harder than I would have liked. The jarring of the impact thankfully cushioned by the Tundra tires. I rolled out for another 20 feet or so before Maggie came to a halt in the knee-deep snow, thankful that I hadn't nosed over. I killed the engine and rested my forehead on the yoke, trying to get my heart rate under control. I didn't think the shaking of my hands had anything to do with the temperature. The daylight was fading, but it was still light enough to allow me a good view of my surroundings through Maggie's windows. I was in the middle of what I guessed was the landing strip, since the tree lines on either side seemed to be about the same distance from me. Those trees were even more imposing down here on the ground. They rose like towering walls on either side, and the woodlands beyond held deep shadows that were only accentuated by the heavy snowfall that continued to obscure my vision. I reached for the radio and keyed the mic, hailing dispatch. I didn't have much faith that the VHF would be able to penetrate the trees and the mountain ridge that lay between me and Buck, but it was worth a shot. After a long moment of hissing static, I tried again, but with the same result. It was doubtful I'd be able to get a signal through until the storm passed, and even then, I didn't think it likely unless I could get Maggie airborne again. With only a moment's deliberation and a resigned sigh, I retrieved the emergency locator beacon from my jacket pocket and activated it. The unit would broadcast a distress signal, along with my location, to the monitoring service. I knew it would be a day at least before help arrived, but the sooner I sent the call, the sooner they'd be able to get to me. I took another look out through the fuselage windows. If there was a landing strip, that meant a possibility that someone was nearby. I didn't think there was a ranger station out here, but there were enough hunting cabins and homesteads that there'd be a decent chance I could find shelter. The interior of the plane was still warm, but I knew that wouldn't last very long in this weather, especially with night approaching. I unbuckled myself and climbed back through the seats into the cargo area, where I pulled on my heavy coat and shouldered my emergency pack. Grabbing my rifle from its rack behind the pilot's seat, I unlatched and swung open the cargo door. A blast of Arctic wind hit me in the face, and I squinted my eyes against it, quickly pulling my goggles on and my hood up before dropping to the snow-covered runway. I pulled the cargo door closed and trudged around the rear of the plane, standing in the furrows left by Maggie's wheels and turning in a slow circle as I tried to discern any indication of human presence. Despite the howling wind that pulled at my coat and hood, I caught the unmistakable scent of wood smoke, and I breathed a small sigh of relief. At least I knew I wasn't alone out here. As I scanned my surroundings, my eyes alighted on what looked like a small utility shed on the western edge of the clearing, and I moved with as much speed as the deep snow would allow in its direction. To the left of it, I spied a waist-high railing marking a walkway that led into a shadowed tree line, and I quickened my pace. I followed the trail, now feeling what were likely wooden planks beneath my boots. Once in the trees, the brutal wind of the storm lessened, and the snow drifted down from the canopy in slow, dancing swirls before settling on the ground with a muted hiss that sounded like the forest around me was quietly exhaling. Between the dim light of the coming dusk and the snowfall, I couldn't see much beyond the trees nearest me, and I relied on the handrail to guide my travel. It was another few minutes of plodding through the snow-covered walkway before I finally saw the building. At first, I thought it was a hunting cabin, solitary amidst the endless sea of trees. As I drew closer, though, I could see it was much larger than I first thought, low and wide, and of modern construction. Some sort of sign stood between two timber uprights just off the path, its face covered in snow and ice. I paused to brush it clear, somewhat surprised to see the blue background and logo of the Alaskan Division of Agriculture. White lettering beneath it indicated that this was the White River Basin Agricultural Research Center. I'd never heard of the ADOA having wilderness research centers, but I suppose it wasn't too far-fetched. Regardless, this was even better news than I'd expected. This meant that I wasn't approaching some isolated hunting camp, but instead a government post. And that meant my chances of survival and rescue had increased significantly. Just as I approached, however, the door abruptly swung open, spilling yellow light across the white snow. A man stepped out from the doorway and shouldered a shotgun, leveling it right at my head. His eyes wide and wild as they stared down the barrel at me. "Stop right there," he shouted at me, his words coming in angry puffs of steam in the frigid air. "Don't come any closer." Whoa. Hold on a minute, Chief. Just wait," I answered, my hands going up reflexively. I'm not here to cause any trouble." He motioned with a shotgun. "Drop the rifle nice and slow. I'm warning you. I won't hesitate to blow you in half if you make any sudden moves." Moving my left hand up to show I was no threat, I bent slowly and placed the rifle on the ground before rising again. "What's going on?" I said. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" he demanded. I could see the muzzle of the shotgun trembling, and I worried that he might end up shooting me by mistake. He was wearing what looked like a government-issued coat with an embroidered patch on the shoulder, and he had a week's growth of beard. "Easy, boss," I said, trying to keep my voice level and calm. "My name's Hooper. I'm a pilot for Viking Bush Charters out of Fairbanks. My plane was forced down in the storm, and I was lucky to find your landing strip before she ended up in the trees." I was starting to wonder if lucky was the right word anymore. He looked at me a long minute, his eyes scanning me over, then motioned at me again with the shotgun. "Take off the goggles. Let me see your eyes." That caught me off guard, but I nodded and slowly moved my hands to remove the tinted goggles, careful not to make any sudden moves. He leaned towards me, eyes locked hard on mine, searchingly. Then, seemingly satisfied, he abruptly lowered his gun and nodded, as if reassuring himself. He jerked his head back toward the doorway, and his entire demeanor suddenly changed. "Well, Hooper, come on inside, and bring your rifle. It's too damn cold out here." With that, he turned and walked back inside, resting the shotgun against the interior wall next to the door. Now even more confused than before, I reached down and picked up my rifle from the snowy ground, my gaze never leaving this man. As inconspicuously as I could, I worked the lever, chambering a cartridge, and followed him in. It was such a bizarre interaction. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't surprise me again if he decided to change his mind. When I entered the building and closed the door behind me, I found myself in what looked like a wood-paneled visitor's room, with a couch on one wall and a blazing fireplace fronted by a couple of chairs on the opposite. The man had moved over to a small table near the fireplace, pouring a glass of whiskey from a half-empty bottle, and now seemingly completely disinterested in my presence. I frowned and glanced around the room. Aside from the sparse furnishings, there was a closed door access from the one I'd entered through, labeled with a restricted access sign. The man took a long drink from his glass and turned back to me, holding the whiskey bottle out and offering. I just shook my head. "I'm sorry about all that," he said, gesturing vaguely to the door behind me. "Can't be too careful. I'm Morgan Tate, field research." I eyed him cautiously. "Okay, Morgan Tate. Do you make a habit of welcoming visitors with a shotgun?" I still wasn't sure exactly who I was dealing with here, but something was clearly off. He just grinned at some private joke that he alone shared, and then ducked his head in a nod, taking another swallow of the whiskey. "Lately? Yeah. Or at least, I would if I got any visitors." He pointed at me with his tumbler and sat heavily in the chair. I was starting to get the impression that this wasn't the first drink of the day for Mr. Morgan Tate. "You're the first living person I've seen in more than a week," he added. "You the only one here?" I asked, looking around the room. There was a row of hooks on the wall beside the door, and I took note of several coats hanging there. He smirked, something unreadable behind his eyes. "Now? Yeah," he said. I didn't know what sort of game he was playing at, but I was starting to lose my patience. "You care to elaborate on that? I'm having kind of a rough day, and you're not making it any easier," I said. The dark-haired man finished off his drink and stood. "Sure, why not? I suppose you're part of this now," he said, pushing past me toward the restricted access door. I followed him as he pushed the door open and proceeded along a narrow, tiled corridor lit by harsh fluorescent lights. It felt out of place, more like I was walking through the halls of a hospital rather than an ADOA building in the middle of the bush. He looked over his shoulder and took note of my surprise. "Yeah, not quite like the ranger stations, is it?" he said, stopping in front of a heavy-looking door at the end of the corridor and keying a quick code into the panel above the handle. I heard a soft click, and he pushed it open, exposing a darkened room beyond. He entered, and the lights flickered on as I followed. The room we now stood in was larger than the previous one, probably 30 feet across, and smelling of antiseptic and chemicals. Several rows of stainless steel tables were neatly arranged within, occupied with various unfamiliar laboratory paraphernalia and equipment. In addition to these lab stations, there also appeared to be examination tables along the far wall, a few of which had white cloths covering unidentifiable shapes. I suppressed a shudder. It reminded me of a morgue, though the concealed objects were too small to be human bodies. "What is this place?" I asked, my eyes taking it all in. "Just like the sign outside says, Hooper, this is the White River Basin Agricultural Research Center," he replied, leaning against one of the tables. "It was set up to monitor large mammal wildlife migrations with potential correlation to climate change." "Huh," I replied evenly. "Sounds interesting." He grinned. "No, it doesn't. Not even to me, and I work here. Would you believe that a week ago, there were 25 researchers living and working here? 25, Hooper. This place was hopping, man." A tingle ran down my spine, and I shifted the rifle in my hand, the weight of it reassuring as it hung at my side. If Tate noticed, he didn't mention it. "What happened last week?" I asked carefully. When he turned back to me, the smirk was gone from his face, and his eyes had widened. Whatever was in his thoughts now, he didn't find it amusing anymore. "That's when they came, Hooper. They? The shadows, man. The shadows. They came from the storm. You remember the storm, don't you?" The storm. I knew what he was talking about, of course. I don't think anyone around here would forget it anytime soon. It was a little more than a week ago when that freak blizzard came out of nowhere, unpredicted and unexplained. What had started out as a cloudless and unseasonably warm morning ended up burying us in nearly 2 feet of snow. The sky had shifted from bright and sunny to a bruised and angry granite color within the span of an hour, clouds rolling so low and heavy that it seemed like you could almost reach up and touch them. Our weather station at the field was clocking sustained wind speeds of 50 knots with gusts up to 85, and we were in a total whiteout condition for the next 14 hours. We were all trapped in the hangar, huddled around the kerosene jet heaters, listening to the wind as it tried to tear apart the heavy steel structure around us. By the time the next day came, it was just gone, replaced by the clear blue skies of the previous morning. Nobody had any good explanation for it, but I'd heard a couple of the old-timers who ran the machine shop whispering about it in the back. I couldn't make out much of what they were saying. I didn't care much, if I'm being honest. But they sounded worried. At the time, I thought it was a little strange that the weather would unnerve them as much as it seemed to. These guys were both full-blooded Inuit and as hard as nails. It was almost comical to think they'd be worried about a surprise blizzard. No, now that I think back on it, it almost seemed like they were more worried about something in the blizzard. I can't be sure since they kept switching in and out of English, but that's the impression I got anyway. The shadows? I asked, confused. His eyes had drifted off into the distance for a moment, lost in his own world. In the next moment, he snapped them back to me eagerly, just like he'd had an epiphany, and said, "Yeah, you want to see one?" Do I want to see a shadow? What are you talking about, man? You're not making any sense. But he was already on the move again, walking across the room to another door. He beckoned me to follow, entered his code, and pushed it open. Wordlessly, I followed, unease whispering in my ear. He led me along another hallway, glancing over his shoulder periodically, like he was making sure I was still there. "I caught one. The other researchers didn't think it was possible, but I knew I could," he said. It almost sounded like he was talking to himself more than to me. He stopped at the door marked OR-2, pushed it open, and walked inside. I trailed behind him hesitantly, feeling apprehensive about this whole thing. A slow feeling of dread had been worming its way through my subconscious, and I wasn't so sure I wanted to follow this man much further. The whole situation felt wrong, and I was starting to think that Mr. Morgan Tate was more than a little unhinged. Where were the other researchers he'd mentioned? I'd questioned whether they ever existed at all, if not for the size of the place and the coats hanging by the door in the reception area. The room I stepped into now was much smaller than the others and had the feel of some sort of control room. The wall to my left held narrow lockers and a rack of coat hooks occupied by several white lab coats. To my right was a console lined with monitors and keyboards, and above that, the entire upper portion of the wall appeared to be an observation window looking into a darkened room. On the opposite wall was one of those airlock doors that you see in isolation areas of hospitals, stainless steel and with a small circular window in its smooth surface. The computer monitors were on and were displaying various graphs and streams of data. Tate sat on one of the chairs at the console and started typing into the keyboard. "They're incredible," he said absently. "Like nothing we've ever seen before." I moved closer to the observation window, straining to make out anything in the darkened room beyond. All I saw was the blackness. "You have something in there?" I asked, suddenly feeling very uncomfortable. I wasn't sure I wanted to see whatever this nutcase wanted to show me. "Why are the lights off?" I asked. He glanced away from the console for a second and turned an unreadable grin on me. "They're not," he said. With that, he stood and leaned forward, pounding the heel of his fist against the window with a resounding shudder, making me jump in surprise. I didn't quite understand what I saw next. The darkness that had obscured my view suddenly swept aside, like someone snatching a curtain violently from across a window and out of sight. But that wasn't quite right either, though. It was more fluid in its abrupt motion, almost like smoke being pulled away by an incredibly powerful and unseen exhaust fan. A muted screeching sound reached my ears, sounding eerily like a poor imitation of a bird of prey. I assumed that the observation room was soundproof, or near enough, and I wondered exactly how loud that wailing must have been for it to reach my ears. I leaned closer to the window, peering upward and to the left where the darkness had disappeared to, but I couldn't see any sign of it. And then I looked to the rest of the room, and I gasped. A dozen corpses lay strewn about the otherwise barren interior of the room. But they weren't bodies anymore. Not really. There were nothing more than skeletons now, still dressed in the clothes they'd worn when they fell. Most were intact, though a few had scattered where they struck the tiled floor. The bones were stripped of all remnants of flesh and were bleached white. "What the hell?" I said. Tate nodded excitedly. "It's incredible, isn't it?" The others left, but I was able to lure 2 of them into the holding room, and I trapped them there. I stepped back, feeling my stomach turn, and I turned my gaze upon the man. "But the bodies," I said. He nodded again, almost eagerly. "That's how I lured him. Most of the remaining researchers fled in here to hide. You see, it needs to eat, to hunt. It can't survive without sustenance, no more than you or I. There were 2 in the beginning, but after the food ran out, this one turned on the other, and now there's only 1. "The food?" I said. "You mean those people?" I tightened the grip on my rifle, and I took a step backwards to put a little space between us. "When the shadows came in the darkness of the storm, a few of them were able to slip into the building before we realized what was happening. Half of the researchers were taken that night in their sleep. You see, they hide and they wait for the right moment. They avoid the light. I think it weakens them, but in the darkness..." He trailed off, and I saw a smile grow across his lips, almost of admiration. In the darkness, that's where they live. That's where they thrive, where they reign." I took another step backwards, my free hand reaching for the door handle behind me and opening it, pushing it with my foot. "You're crazy," I said, bringing the rifle up. If he even noticed it, he gave no indication. His eyes had taken on that maniacal glint again, and he stood, giving a small nod that I thought was meant to reassure me. "There's no more for it to eat, Hooper. It's been days since I've been able to feed it." He took a slow step towards me, and I matched it with a retreating one of my own. He smiled and continued, as if explaining to a child, "I have only myself left to offer, but that's not enough. Don't you understand? This isn't just a thing. It's not just an animal. It's far beyond our understanding, far beyond our own primitive evolution. It's perfect." His eyes flicked away from me for a moment to an illuminated red button on the console nearby, and his hand drifted over to it. "Don't," I shouted, bringing the rifle up to my shoulder. "Don't do it, Tate." "But there's nothing to be afraid of," he replied. "It's quick." His hand hovered over the button. "I will shoot you, Tate. Don't make me do it," I warned. From where I stood, I could see another one of those airlock doors through the observation window. And to my horror, a swirling mass of blackness massed at the threshold. I could almost feel its anticipation. This wasn't the first time it had been fed. It knew what was coming. In that instant, when my eyes flicked away from him, Tate stabbed at the button. With a curse, I squeezed the trigger at the same instant, but it was too late. He'd already pressed it. I watched in horror as the twin airlock doors began to retract, and without another thought, I turned and I fled as fast as I could go. Thankfully, the codes required to open the doors weren't needed to exit them, and I flew down the hall and through the research room. As I passed it and threw open the door to the reception area, I heard that wailing screech again from behind me, haunting and otherworldly, echoing through the empty facility, much louder than before. And then I heard another sound, this one the agonized screaming of Morgan Tate. I only gave it the briefest of thoughts as I jerked open the outer door and I fled into the snowstorm. I could only hope that feeding time would give me enough of a window to make it back to Maggie. The air had darkened even more with the coming of dusk, and had grown colder. Thankfully, the storm seemed to have lost much of its fury, the front having now passed by, and leaving me in its relatively calm wake. I ran along the path, just enough light remaining of the day to follow the tracks I'd made on my way in. The rifle was heavy in my grip, but I didn't dare lose my only defense. When that howling screech echoed through the trees behind me, I redoubled my speed, praying it wouldn't be able to find me before I'd reached Maggie. The cold air burned my lungs, and my throat was raw by the time I reached the snow-covered landing strip. I almost cried with joy at the sight of my bright yellow Maggie. I reached the cargo hatch and swung it open, throwing myself inside and pulling it shut behind me, just as another one of those haunting wails reached my ears. Closer this time. I didn't dare look out the windows as I threw off my pack and rifle and climbed back into the pilot's seat. I buckled on my harness and my hands danced over the controls, the startup procedure second nature. Battery master on, fuel selector to center, mixture lever forward, fuel oil shutoff lever down. A resounding high-pitched howl penetrated the cabin, and something black moved outside, rushing from window to window, door to door, searching. It was here now, trying to find a way inside. Concentrate, I thought. Throttle at 10%. Fuel pressure pumped to 5 psi. Engine primed. I froze. My windshield had suddenly gone completely black, shrouding me in darkness. Even though I couldn't see anything, in the featureless void just a foot away from my face, I could almost feel its desperation. I felt its sightless gaze, and below that, an inhuman and alien hunger. I pressed the starter switch and the 9-cylinder radial engine started turning over. Slowly at first, laggard and sluggish. My blood chilled as I realized it wasn't catching. It wasn't starting. My thoughts flew back to the engine problems I'd been experiencing before my emergency landing. And in that moment, I was certain my luck had finally run out. But then it backfired. Then another. And then a third. Coughing black puffs of smoke from the exhaust. And then it caught. And that big, beautiful Pratt & Whitney radial took over, the loud drone rising smooth and steady as Maggie woke from her slumber. I pushed the throttle forward, inertia pressing me into my seat. I no longer cared about the engine misfires or the storm. A fiery death in the trees was preferable to whatever that thing had in store for me. The snow was deep, and even with the big Tundra tires, I had to work to keep from nosing over as I began to gain speed. At some point, the black mass disappeared from my windscreen, and I was greeted with the glorious sight of an open path before me. With the passing of the storm front, the wind had shifted directions, and I was into a headwind now, perfect for my needs. I pushed the throttle to full and pulled back gently on the yoke. I felt the wheels leave the ground, now free from the snow's drag, and continued my climb until I was above the trees and gently banking back toward the south, towards home. As I passed over the landing strip, I thought I could just make out a black shape on the ground below, stretching and snaking along after me before I lost it in the trees. The engine miss returned after another 10 minutes of flying, but Maggie carried me back to safety. She always took care of me. 40 minutes later, I was back on the ground in Fairbanks and taxiing for the hangar. Stopping the bush plane just outside, I shut her down, unbuckled myself, and carefully climbed down to the runway, where my body fought with itself for which was going to happen first, the puking or the passing out. Mike Nichols came jogging out of the hangar after hearing my approach and helped steady me. "Damn, Hoop, you gave us all a scare," he smiled amiably. "Must have been a hell of a flight. You know, you look like you saw a ghost, man." I could only nod and stumble my way towards the warmth of the hangar, grateful for his shoulder to brace against. Just before we reached the service door, he paused and looked back at Maggie. "Bud told me he had some engine problems, but he didn't say anything about a fire." I frowned and shook my head. "No fire," I said. "I just lost some cylinders." He stood there for a moment longer, an odd expression on his face, before opening the door and ushering me inside. "Huh, that's weird," he began. "I thought I saw some black smoke coming from under the engine right after you shut her down."
Dr. Daniel Vance was a smart man, too smart for his own good, maybe. 40 years old, a lecturer in fluid dynamics with a mind made of shapes and numbers. No one knows why, but one day, on a whim, he crunched the numbers on the apocalypse and came to a troubling conclusion. He didn't exactly share what he deduced, but given that he immediately quit his job and liquidated his many assets, it's fair to say it wasn't positive. Swept up in the wake of this tremendous upheaval was his wife, a 24-year-old PhD student who had grown infatuated with Daniel some time before. She loved this strange bear of a man who could just as easily build a log cabin as he could explain the idiosyncrasies of an asteroid's orbit. Speaking with Daniel always left you with the profound impression he was right. So when he told her what he wanted to do, she agreed. 15 years and 5 children later, the Vances were living in the distant woods just beyond my hometown. They were enigmatic, richer than the Pope, and extremely serious about their prepper lifestyle. But they were also funny, easygoing, and incredibly compelling to speak to. Larger-than-life survivalists who swept into town with bizarre requests that filled local businesses were all shipped through the remote mountains so that the Vances could build their shelter. The advanced methods they used to keep it secret were legendary. Daniel had once spent 6 months earning the license necessary to drive HGVs up to his compound so that no one else would lay eyes on it. And on one occasion, when a company had refused his request for GPS tracker-free vehicles, he bought them out wholesale so that they had no choice. So, when they stopped appearing in town during the pandemic, when requests for food and goods stopped and all contact was dropped, most attributed it to lockdown. They had a bunker and had spent their entire lives training to be self-sufficient in the wake of civilization's collapse. Even Alexander, the youngest at just 3, was already chopping firewood as a chore and learning what local plants were edible. Most of us just assumed that if anyone could ride out COVID without breaking a sweat, it was the Vances. The reality turned out to be something else. When the worst came to light, we discovered that Daniel had used the pandemic as an excuse for a dry run. The family intended to spend 6 months in lockdown and essentially beta test their fallout bunker. 3 months in, and the sheriff received a distress call on the radio. Coordinates were provided by the hushed voice of a sobbing child that most assumed to be Alexander, even though that's never been proven. Police arrived and found the bunker still sealed. It took hours for emergency responders to cut into the door, all while efforts were made to contact the family within, but to no avail. Once inside, police were left dumbfounded. There was no one to be rescued. No bodies, no survivors. There was evidence that the door's locking mechanism had failed and trapped the Vances inside with no way out. But if so, where had they gone? Beds and cots lay everywhere, with molding yellow sheets, buckets close to hand with stains all around them. Some doors were barred, others smashed to pieces. There was even evidence of a makeshift quarantine and, in places, what looked like violence. The police, usually a fantastic source of gossip, were not forthcoming until the town demanded answers and the sheriff was forced to offer only the barest of outlines. An outbreak of a waterborne illness had struck the Vances down not long after they were locked inside and unable to seek help. Rumors of contagion were overstated, fueled by the unrelated rise of COVID. Whatever contaminant had killed the Vances, it was non-organic in nature. No need to panic. The Vances' loved ones had been notified the bunker was going to be demolished, and we could put this terrible tragedy behind us. Of course, we still had questions, 1,000 of them. Why hadn't the family called for help? They had radios, computers, and smartphones too. They were survivalists, not Amish. And where were they? What happened to their bodies? Why hadn't they simply left? We shouted these and more at the town meeting, but the police simply refused to comment. For most of us, the excitement lasted another week or two until we realized we weren't getting any answers anytime soon. Besides, the pandemic was in full swing, and most of us had other things to worry about. The tragic story eventually faded until it was just one of those awful things in the town's history that we didn't talk about. I was as guilty as anyone else of just forgetting about it. I certainly never expected to find the bunker out there in the woods. Faded police tape still on the door that hung wide open with scorch marks around the lock. I stood out in the woods like someone had cut a hole right in the fabric of reality. The darkness so deep and black it almost ached to look at. The sight of it made my heart drop into my stomach. It radiated pain. Does that make sense? I think part of my lizard brain picked out details that wouldn't become apparent to me until I got closer. Like the bloody finger streaks that stained the handle where someone had scraped furiously at the lock without success, and a tiny viewing window had been smashed with a hammer that still lay nearby. I needed only to glimpse it to imagine the family taking turns to stand there and scream into the woods, desperate for rescue. Under any other circumstances, I would have run, but I'd gone there looking for my dog, and my light revealed a few wet paw prints making their way down the dusty concrete tunnel. Half Bernese and half collie, Ripley was the sort of dog who trembles in my arms when a storm buffets the windows and needs his paws held when we brush him. I love him. I don't have much of a family, or a wife, or even many friends, but I have Ripley, and I could no more have turned around and gone home to an empty apartment where I would have to sob my grief away than I could flap my arms and fly. He was my dog, and I'd raised him since he was a puppy, and I wasn't going to leave him out in those woods. I went in after him. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it wouldn't be good. Whatever the police had found, they'd not only kept most of the morbid details to themselves, they had also lied. The bunker was not demolished, or even sealed off, in fact. Looking at the occasional blue latex glove tossed aside, and the one or two broken police-issued flashlights, it seemed like the last people inside had been in a hurry to get out. Given this was where 7 people had presumably died, I assumed it was someone's job to clean it all up, but the corridor looked largely untouched. Just a few meters in, and manic writing started to cover the walls, the desperate scrawls of a lone survivor left there to be rediscovered like cave paintings. Most were deliberations on how to get out, diagrams, blueprints, equations, and formula, all focused on the door and the circuits responsible for its faulty lock. I instinctively assumed they belonged to Daniel, and that he'd been the last to die. What a god-awful fate for a man to outlive his children. And yet it got worse. Slowly, the writing changed from equations and plans to a desperate scrawl. The same few phrases repeated over and over.
5 doors. 5. 6. 6. Didn't make it. 6 doors. 6.
It seemed like the kind of thing you'd find in an asylum. a psychotic rambling punctuated only by 6 paragraphs right at the end. Each letter was impeccably neat, and each small paragraph was topped with a beautifully drawn Christian cross.
Elliot Vance, age 15. A gifted guitarist. He liked boys even though he thought I did not know. I loved him with everything I had. He would have made a great man. Alicia Vance, age 14. She liked to paint and to shoot. She had her mother's mean streak. It would have served her well in the future. Elijah Vance, age 8. The smartest of us all.
These were Daniel's memoirs to his family, and seeing the words lit up by the torch was a haunting insight into the overwhelming despair he'd endured. He must have realized he wouldn't get the chance to speak at his family's funeral or write their obituaries. This was his last desperate way of making sure the world might one day know them as he did, as real people. The words marked the end of the tunnel, standing adjacent to a trapdoor in the ground. It was not open, but the tunnel came to a dead end immediately afterwards, and Ripley's prince disappeared at the hatch. I feared he might be in danger, but still I stopped and looked at the bunker door 20 meters behind me. The once gloomy forest looked so bright. Even on this cloudy day, the air dotted with rain. A part of me felt like I was leaving the whole world behind as I began to climb down the ladder. I entered a large, circular living space that was packed with furniture and little nooks and crannies. The walls were covered with folding beds and tables, and every inch was multifunctional. A dining space could become a sitting space, which in turn might be where someone slept or even exercised. It all depended on what particular bit of furniture you unfolded, or unclipped, or unfurled. 7 people in close quarters, nowhere near enough privacy. It made sense they went with this cluttered, overlapping use of space. But it was still a large room, bigger than most studio apartments. And there were a few corridors that led deeper into the earth, telling me the bunker had unseen depths. I looked for some sign of my dog, and soon found his trail. But this far from the rainy entrance, Ripley's prints were starting to fade. After barely a few meters, they petered out vaguely in the direction of a nearby door. I wanted to follow, but stopped myself from rushing onwards. It was unlikely Ripley was getting out any other way, and I'd do us no good getting myself hurt. I decided to take a look around and quickly spotted a dinner table. If I needed proof the police had not bothered with a cleanup, this was it. The plates were still out, the food rotten to a strange, blackened husk. A child's hat lay across one place setting. The once creamy fleece turned to a sickly green and yellow. The chairs had their backs reinforced with wooden beams fitted with long grooves so that someone with the width of a nail could slide into them. And on each of the cushions there were foul-smelling stains that looked oddly like an ass print. I touched one with a gloved hand and the material crackled audibly. Whatever it was, similar stains were on the cutlery and plates, and there were even handprints of it placed firmly on the tablecloth. At first I thought it was blood, but I wasn't quite right. It was too contained to be from leaking blood. On the back of one of the chairs, a stain tapered exactly where a woman's waist would be, like a near-perfect silhouette. I shivered as I remembered that Miranda Vance had always been a slim woman, and wondered how she had left her imprint on the gray fabric. Using my torch, I saw that these stains repeated on the oddest of places. Yes, there were some on the beds and blankets, and even patches of plain floor, exactly like you might expect in a room full of sick people. But why did one stain on the floor bear such a strange resemblance to a child huddled in a fetal position? And why was the same stuff all over the TV remote, and on the bookshelves and board games too? Everything from sofa cushions to DVD boxes to piles of dirty laundry were covered in the same dried, brownish material that gave off a foul, coppery miasma. I found the jigsaw particularly baffling. Someone had set up another table with 4 chairs, all modified with the same back support as those by the dinner table, and a jigsaw had been laid out with 4 separate piles, but only one was depleted. The rest looked largely untouched, almost like someone had portioned out pieces for 3 other people who had absolutely no interest in going along with it. maybe Daniel had tried to keep up morale while the family was sick. God help me, if that were true. I couldn't help but imagine the poor man sat there with his loved ones close to death, desperately trying to encourage them to click their own pieces into place while they faded in and out of consciousness. Something about that room emanated madness, and the longer I stayed down there, flickering the bright disk of light of my torch from one detail to another, the more I wanted to leave. One door had wooden beams nailed across it. One sofa had been partially disassembled, multiple beds had been burned, and all the light bulbs had been removed and put into a box on the kitchen countertop. Looking up at the ceiling, I finally had some insight into why the police were so confident that the Vances had not survived, despite never finding their bodies. Someone had jammed a human finger into one of the empty sockets, almost like they expected it to glow with the flick of a switch. What was it about this place that had caused the police to leave and never return? Not to even take that finger and test it for signs of illness, or even just to confirm who it belonged to. I decided it was time to hurry up and find my dog. People had died in that place, and while I'm not superstitious, I can't be the only skeptic who has done the calculations in his head and realized it costs nothing to be respectful of ghosts. That bunker was cramped and terrifying, and the air stank so bad I started to worry I'd get sick myself. It served no one any good to linger, but I'd be damned if I just walk away and leave Ripley to rot down there. It's not like he could climb a ladder and get out on his own, even if I wasn't entirely sure how he'd gotten down there in the first place. Summoning what little bravery I had left, I called out and broke the silence. Something which felt like a terrible taboo in that god-awful place, like screaming in a graveyard. "Ripley?" I waited and hoped to hell I'd hear the pitter-patter of his paws, but for the longest of moments, there was only the kind of silence that makes you wonder if someone or something in the darkness was holding its breath, trying to look like just another patch of nothing, biding its time until you finally turn around and show it your back. The TV came on with a burst of white noise that was so loud and so sudden I cried. I threw my arms up and nearly fell backwards onto a rolled-out sleeping bag that looked like it had spent a week in the sewer. By the time I realized what had caused the noise, I could already hear a tinny rendition of Daniel Vance's voice.
I realize the issue here. I need to emphasize just how little I understand anything that's...
I frowned at the screen as I approached. It showed a greenish infrared view of the bunker with Daniel up front and the dinner table behind him. It was grainy and hard to see, but I could clearly tell that his family were sitting in those chairs.
Miranda was the first to fall ill. Looking back, it makes perfect sense. Miranda often went into storage to fetch food for cooking, and we found it behind one of the refrigerators. So that's... shit.
One of the figures in the background slumped onto the table with a loud clank and sent a plate spinning off onto the ground.
Shit.
Daniel muttered as he got up and grabbed the woman by the shoulders and sat her upright.
Miranda never did like my cooking.
He laughed as he fussed with something at the back of the chair.
The rods are much better than tape. They fit right into the spine, and with a little modification, I can just slot them into the chairs. That way, everyone is able to join in for dinner. I'm working on something similar for a family game night.
Daniel wandered over to the camera, and with a grin, he lifted it from the tripod and scanned the dinner table. What I saw nearly made me drop my torch. His family were long dead. Gaunt faces, missing noses, lips that had receded to reveal awful grins. They were corpses, plain as day, even when viewed through such a low-resolution image. The only thing that made them seem remotely alive was the way their eyes still reflected the infrared back so that they glowed in the dark. And yet Daniel seemed oblivious to it all. He tousled Elliot's hair, kissed his wife on the cheek, and ran a hand across one young girl's shoulder. He even picked the young Alexander up from his chair, and I assume he coddled him. I don't know for sure because I looked away, unwilling to see the poor boy up close. Eyes averted from the screen, I couldn't help but pan my torch across to that same dinner table and shiver as I finally realized what all those stains were. Not quite blood, but close. Liquefying flesh. Left alone for months, Daniel had not put his family's bodies to rest. Instead, he had moved them around from place to place and puppeted them, living life as if nothing had really changed. Looking at where those stains had settled, I saw a clear pattern emerge. He had put them to bed, he had set dinner, he had propped them up to watch TV or gave them their favorite book. They even sat there as lifeless husks while Daniel waited for them to complete a jigsaw. The idea horrified me to my core.
Back to work. It's obviously not part of the original designs. No room on the other side, not on the blueprints. Elliot didn't believe me, and why would he? I made every inch of this place, but I did not install that door in storage on the bottom level. I checked the cameras and some of the photos I took during the build, and the wall is just blank. But the door's there now, and it must lead somewhere. I don't know when or why it opens, but it does. And the next time, I'll be ready, because I have to know what's on the other side and why it did this to us. Alone down there, often all asleep at once. Anything could have slit our throats and been done with it, but it didn't. It took its time, and I have to know why. It took our radios and our computers and phones, one by one, none of us noticing until it was far too late. I kept telling the kids they needed to take better care of their things, and even as they complained, I just assumed the phones were lying behind some shelf. Where else could they go in a locked bunker? But it wasn't the children at all. Looking back, there are so many signs. Who kept taking away the lights? Who kept draining the batteries in our flashlights? How long did we live with it before we finally realized we weren't alone? Was it here every step of the way? A door out of nothing that leads nowhere. At least most of the time, because I know for a fact it does not always open to a blank wall. There is something behind it. I can hear it shuffling around in there. Wet breath rattling in its lungs. A horrible sound I hear roaming these walls when it thinks I'm asleep.
I listened to Daniel, fascinated by this strangely compelling rant, when movement caught my eye. An infrared camera running in the dark. Its image a roiling mess of uniform noise. What was it I'd seen? I paused the tape and rewound, squinting. I saw 2 pinpricks of light in the darkness just over Daniel's shoulder. Slowly, the image resolved itself in my mind. I knew what I was seeing, and it turned my blood to ice. Miranda Vance had turned her head, and her lifeless eyes glowed as she fixed them on the back of Daniel's head.
Not even any point in leaving at this stage. I'm no doctor, but that door is giving off enough radiation to, kill a family of 7. If none of us had touched it, being in the same room is too risky, but not lethal. But given how sick we've become, it's pretty obvious our curiosity got the better of us. One by one, we all got too close. Or maybe not. Maybe that thing on the other side came through and did this. I don't even know. Wait, what was that?
Daniel turned and the camera stopped recording. The image it froze on was of a lone man, bright as a star in the camera's lens, facing off against unknowable darkness, broken only by 6 pairs of white, glowing eyes. I became painfully aware of my position relative to the table, and I had the painful premonition that if I turned, those chairs would not be empty. I would see the Vances, all of them, Daniel as well, waiting for me. Heads turned, bodies left to rot for years in the dark. Behind me, something shifted. It breathed, loud, quick, and I knew what it was. I knew. It came at me so fast that when I felt something hot and wet touch my hand, I screamed, only for the presence to suddenly recoil. But then without hesitation, it leapt at me and bore me against the ground. I wept as Ripley licked my face. She was shivering and, worst of all, silent, which was not normal. He was not a quiet dog, not when greeting me and not when excited like he was now, but whatever he'd seen down here, he clung to me and dug his paws into my shoulders like he wanted to be cradled over the shoulder. It was something that he had been too big to do for years. "Oh, you idiot!" I cooed in a soft whisper, and even in the dark, I could feel his tail wagging. Joking aside, I felt nothing but relief at finding him. "Let's get the hell out of here." I picked him up, straining a little under the weight, but refusing to give in to tired muscles, and made for the ladder. It wasn't easy climbing the 3 or 4 rungs to the hatch, but I managed and gave the hatch a shove. First one hand, then two, and again with everything I had, but the hatch still refused to budge. I started pounding at it with my fists, but all I achieved was a sore wrist. The hatch had jammed when somehow the handle had been snapped clean off. Now I'd need a pair of pliers or something to cut through the metal bar locking it shut. My fingers couldn't move it, nor could I brute force the hatch open. The metal bar was an inch thick, and at the very least, I'd need some tools to get at it from this side. Well, at least it's fixable, I thought as I climbed back down and caught my breath. On one wall, I noticed a simple diagram of the bunker made in chalk. It had 3 floors. The bottom was storage. Daniel had mentioned that before, and I noticed that he had drawn through it with a large red X. And the top floor was labeled quarters, where I stood now. But the middle floor was labeled workshops, and it was there I realized I'd find what I needed. There was one door that opened onto a concrete stairwell, and standing at the top, I shone my light down the spiraling guardrails, unsure of what I hoped to see. There were only harsh shadows and the sense of something foul rising up on the air. A smell that tickled my throat and burned a little in my lungs. Had the police even gone down this far? Had they seen what I'd seen on that TV and just left? Somehow, I thought it was unlikely that had been enough to send the entire sheriff's department running. So, was it something else that had done it? Something that had been enough to terrify dozens of armed men? Something that was almost definitely down there. The door. I went down quietly. At first, I considered leaving Ripley behind, but after losing him the first time, I decided I'd rather risk it just to know that he was right next to me. Besides, he was being quieter than I was, and I didn't feel much like going down those stairs on my own. He accompanied me with only the quiet sound of his paws on concrete. A sound I found deeply comforting as I barely managed to keep my torch from shaking in my hand and my breathing steady. Down one floor, and I found the workshop exactly as you might expect. A large space filled with generators and fuel and water tanks, boilers and heaters, and pretty much anything and everything else you'd need to survive, but which you couldn't put outside due to fallout. Wires, pipes, and tubes ran from one end of the room to the other, and even years later, most of the machinery still hummed in the pitch-black emptiness. An idea I found deeply unsettling. Taking one look at that strange tangle of harsh shapes and industrial figures looming out of the walls and floor, I shivered and looked around, quickly finding a small area Daniel had corded off for his own use. About 1/5 of the total floor space, there was a large workbench and some seriously high-end machining equipment, all very well used. Buzzsaws, drills, belt sanders, welding torches, everything a man needed to do it himself. And Daniel had been busy. I'm not sure what exactly it was he'd been working on, but there was an arm on the bench. It sat atop a pile of papers that had slowly turned brown over the years until the whole thing looked like it had been soaked in tobacco spit. On the whiteboard was a faded but still visible diagram of what looked like a ball and socket joint. I thought of the tape, of Daniel's little mechanisms to keep his family upright, then looked at the arm and suppressed a momentary gag reflex. I don't know if Dan had been working on posable limbs or just a way to put the decomposing remains back together after they'd started to fall apart, but the size of the arm suggested a preteen child, and he'd left it out on the surface like it was a disassembled clock. It was also missing a finger. Just how crazy was he? I wondered as I pinched my nose with one hand and began overturning boxes looking for a hefty pair of pliers, or maybe a hacksaw. Ripley backed away from the noise, but once I made sure he wasn't going anywhere, I carried on, grabbing and pulling at box after box, hoping I'd find what I was looking for. Anything to break that metal bar. In the end, I managed to get a pair of bolt cutters, a crowbar, and a heavy-duty pair of pliers. One went in my pockets, one went down the back of my jeans, and the other was clutched in my fist, too large to be tucked away in my clothes. The bolt cutters felt hefty in my hand, which was a bit of a comfort, but the feeling didn't last long. Something moved in the darkness. Out there in the twisted jungle of shadows cast by all those pipes and wires that ran from one machine to the next, a figure moved. Thin, but unmistakably human in its outline. I couldn't help but remember what I'd seen on that tape. Surely it couldn't have been real. Maybe Daniel had rigged something up, some fishing wire and a motor maybe? The idea that those bodies had been moving on their own, I couldn't be sure of that, could I? It was a frightening idea, one my mind had latched onto out of sheer panic, that was all. And then I saw them, a pair of white pinpricks reflecting back at me from the depths of that cluttered room. Ripley, already behind me, head nuzzled into my leg, pushed even closer against me, and let out a barely audible whine under his breath, the behavior of a dog who was terrified, close to pissing himself with fear. Just a bit of metal, I told myself as the light shone so violently in my hand I struggled to see straight. Just 2 shiny bits of metal. They blinked and began to come towards me. If I had any doubts left, they were dispersed by the sight of a pale white hand emerging into the light. I ran straight to the stairs and went to climb them, but only 1 or 2 steps in, I saw something gripping the handrail on the top floor. A moldy clump of flesh, just recognizable as a fist. The flesh withered until the fingers were basically bone. Without meaning to, I brought my light up out of habit, and I saw the bloated face of a hairless corpse glaring down at me. I couldn't even tell you if it had been a teenage girl or the 60-year-old Daniel. Either way, I instinctively turned and found another body shambling towards me out of the workshop. I was trapped, nowhere to go. I could feel Ripley behind me, an adult dog, tail between his legs, shivering like a puppy and desperate to be picked up. God, I needed him to stay together for a little longer. I couldn't take him in my arms, but I couldn't leave him either. With nowhere to go, I ran down and entered the storage. There was the temptation to stop once I hit the bottom. Down here, the air was thicker, and the sounds of my breathing were muted, somehow distant, but I only had to look back up to see 3 pairs of eyes glowing down at me. So, without giving any of it much further thought, I barreled down the corridor and stumbled onto a door at random. Opening it, I saw what looked like your standard storage room. Only most of the shelves had been overturned, and the food left to rot on the floor. 1 or 2 shelving units were still upright though, and their shelves were covered in tall, opaque boxes that made them a fantastic hiding spot. That, I decided, would have to be where I crouched down and turned off my light. I was already inside when I realized that wasn't all that was in there. The door almost looked normal. I could see why Daniel must have been confused by it because it looked a little bit like the other doors down here. But it was different too. It was too tall and too wide, about 1.5 feet off the ground, and the metal rusted in its entirety, like it had aged out of sync with everything else down here. All around the jam was a profusion of wet, soppy moss, like the kind you find hanging off trees in a swamp, and every few seconds, the door would leak something strange and oily. Of course, that wasn't too strange in itself, but the leak was horizontal, creating a puddle about the size of a man that defied all reason. Remembering Daniel's words about radiation, I instinctively inched away from this puddle and the door on the opposite wall, backing myself into the darkest, quietest corner I could while I pulled Ripley behind me and hoped to hell he wouldn't give me away. Once I was in there, I turned off my light and waited. I must have taken longer than I'd thought to hide, because it was barely a few seconds later when a few figures entered the room. It was pitch black after I'd turned off my torch, but they made enough noise to let me know that at least 2 of them had stumbled in after me. I stayed there, unable to see anything, not sure if they were heading straight for me or just getting ready to leave, forced to hold out and let luck decide my fate when I finally heard something scrape against the wall barely 2 feet from where I stood. I gave up and switched my light on, desperate to know what was coming for me. The sound had been terribly misleading. Daniel Vance was no more than 6 inches from my face. "Get out," he hissed from a toothless and cracked smile. A living corpse just like the others. Somehow, a flash of intelligence remained in those wide, terrified eyes. And then I heard it. The creaking of a door, and without even thinking, I turned the light and saw it on the wall. I saw it open, and behind the strange steel, there was more than just plain old concrete. Much more. I saw a raging gullet of flesh, a ringed tube of pulsing muscles lined with teeth the size of hands, a spiraling descent into madness. Hot, fetid air washed into the room, buffeting me and the rotting corpses, all of us paralyzed by what we were seeing. Even if most of the figures besides Daniel and myself, they didn't have eyes to see with. What the? I muttered, unable to take my eyes from the flesh tube beyond the doorway. It's coming, Daniel whispered as he grabbed me with one fist and hurled me out of the room. I hit the door and skidded along a slick fluid left by the Vance's footprints, the smell of which turned my stomach. Perhaps the worst detail was it was cold. I don't know why I'd expected whatever oozed from them to be feverishly hot, but it wasn't. It soaked my shirt like I'd fallen into a muddy puddle.
It's coming.
This voice wasn't Daniel's. I couldn't say for sure, but it sounded like a child's whisper. One by one, the bodies shuffled over to the open door and knelt before it. I don't know why, but I got the impression the others had lost pretty much everything left of their minds. But Daniel remained aware. He looked back at me once more and spoke before he pressed his head to the door in supplication with the others.
The only thing we did wrong was be here for it to torture. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Leave. It won't let us go. It won't even let us die. And if it catches you, it won't let you go either.
His head kissed the dirt, and then something reached through the door and gripped his head in its palm the way you or I might pick up an apple. In full panic, I ran over, grabbed my dog and the bolt cutters, and ran like my legs were pistons, machines whose signals of exhaustion and fatigue could not slow me down or cause me to fall. I had to move. I had to leave. The hand that grabbed Daniel, the sight of it flushed my mind clean like some kind of enema. It hurt to see the image replay in my mind, but there was nothing else in my head echoing around except the sight of fingers with one too many knuckles and nails as large as phones. I reached the top floor and nearly collapsed from breathlessness, but I wouldn't let myself stay down for long. I crawled over the ladder and climbed up and immediately went to work trying to cut the metal lock. It was hell with just one hand, the other clinging to the torch that I kept frantically pointing at the door behind me, and it wasn't long before I fumbled one too many times and dropped my only source of life. No, no, no! I moved, but there was no time to look for it. I had to get out, and I had to get out fast. I couldn't see, but I was sure I could hear something climbing up those stairs. Not the steady thump of human feet. No, this was different. This was a rapid pitter-patter of a spider, maybe. Something with hundreds of feet or hands or God knows what, skittering along the floor and walls and ceiling, pulling itself along with a body whose mere shape would offend God. Using all my strength, I leaned hard on the bolt cutters, and at last, the bolt gave. I threw the hatch open and got just enough ambient light to see Ripley hovering at the bottom of the ladder. I crouched down, scooped him up, and fled up the ladder so quickly that my muscles turned to jelly at the top, and I fell over onto my hands and knees. But still, I was out. The long corridor covered in writing was ahead of me, and at the very end, a doorway now capped by the tired blue light of the full moon. Ripley needed no encouragement. He whipped down the corridor with canine speed, and I followed at a broken and stumbling crawl, eventually shouldering past the doorway and collapsing onto the forest floor. For a few seconds, I drifted in and out of consciousness, but when I looked up and saw the canopy overhead, moving, the branches backlit by a full moon, I snapped awake and glared down at something gripping my ankle. The hand had reached out of the dark and seized me and was slowly dragging me back into the earth below. Whatever it was, most of its body lurked out of sight in the shadows behind the doorway, but the hand that crushed my leg was the size of my torso, with an arm that looked like it belonged to a mole rat. I struck it with my own fist. I dug my nails in. I cried and kicked and screamed, but nothing could stop it. From behind the door, something like a face grinned and leered at me with joy. It was taking its time, sure enough, pulling me in so slowly that it gave my mind all the time in the world to appreciate the nightmare that awaited me. I thinking, if that moment you'd given me a gun, I would have shot myself, because God help me, I couldn't escape the look in Daniel's eyes. How he'd knelt to worship this thing like a man who knew that hope or pride or joy or anything with even a hint of goodness was so far out of reach for him it might as well be a dream. How long was this thing going to keep me down there? I wept like a child, feeling my mind was slowly cracking as I tried everything to stop that thing from pulling me into the shadows. I kicked at the earth, dug into it using my hands, looking for a root or a pipe or anything to hold on to. Nothing I did would slow it down. I was no more a foot from the doorway when Ripley reappeared. A dog afraid of hoovers and plastic bags and doors that move on their own. A dog who once got stared down by a particularly feisty rabbit who stopped mid-chase and turned around, baffling the predator on its tail. A dog you couldn't even watch scary movies around, and he lunged at that arm like he was a wolf, like he'd always been one. While he didn't quite break the skin, the pressure was enough to make the thing's grip weaken, and I slid my leg out. Unable to stand, I knelt and grabbed the dog and pulled as hard as I could, and now that thing bled at least a little, and the pressure of the jaws and the sliding teeth ripped into its flesh. Together, at least, Ripley and I were let go and sent rolling backwards head over heels. I wasted no time waiting or looking or processing. I heaved the dog onto my chest and crawled until I passed out, making it maybe half a kilometer away. Only when I could no longer see the door did I let myself fall to the ground face first and gave up consciousness. The doctor said I had pneumonia, which I suppose made some kind of sense. I might have believed them were it not for the sheriff's visit, asking strange questions of me as I lay in bed about what I may or may not have seen. I dismissed them to the best of my ability. I wasn't interested in chasing that particular nightmare down, figuring out if it had been real or not, at least not while I lay there half drowning in my own infection. To be fair, I had at least some sympathy for why the police had done so little to seal the place off. I had, on occasion, thought about going down and doing the job myself, but to this day, I still have nightmares about being pulled into the dark beyond that door. Not just the bunker door, not the one I narrowly avoided at the end, but the one below. What I saw was a kind of madness. I'm sure of it, and I often think of Daniel's words. It didn't need a reason, just an opportunity. Somehow, the Vances were that opportunity. Maybe they built their bunker on a ley line or a weak spot between dimensions, or the site of former satanic rituals. I'm not sure if it even matters. They went into the dark thinking it'd be a safe place to wait out the world's troubles, but something had been down there waiting for them, waiting for a chance to get a family of 7 people, to lock them in and deprive them of escape, and slowly take from them everything it could. I've moved since then. I couldn't help it. It wasn't just the memories you see. It was the shortwave radio I kept in my basement, something my father passed on to me when I was just a boy. God, I'd forgotten about it. At least until I woke up one day to the sound of it blaring white noise down in the dark. And buried in that sound was the faint whispering of a man, his voice barely recognizable, but unmistakably his.